friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. And I'm here today to talk about making a floral kimchi. Does that sound strange or what? But this is nothing that is new to me. I've been doing this for years. The very first kimchi I made was using nasturtium leaves and flowers like you'll see here. And what gave me the idea to do that then was knowing that nasturtiums have this naturally radish kind of flavor. They already taste like a brassica of some kind, even though they are not. And so I thought, why not try those for making a kimchi? Because I have a lot of them coming in and I think it would be delicious. And it was. And so I actually did a video just on that, and it's been like 7 years ago that I did that. And then I don't remember when I did this, but somewhere between that and now, I did another kimchi where I had tons of calendula flowers coming in. So I thought, I'm going to make a kimchi using calendula flowers instead. Still using the same spices and other vegetables I like to add to my kimchis. And it was also wonderful. So I found those two flowers make a great kimchi. Now in this last one, and you can see it here, I've got half of it remaining. This is what it looks like now. It's well over a week old now, so it takes about 3 to 4 days for it to ferment, and then you can start eating on it. The one thing you'll notice about your floral kimchis and other stuff, they're going to be more apt to get a lot more liquid in them over time. And before I continue, in this particular kimchi, I decided to mix the two, the calendula and the nasturtiums, as well as adding some lily petals, daylily flower petals. So I had the pink and I have the orange because that's the two colors of lilies I have right now. I'd like to get some yellow ones as well so I can have a nice blend. But daylilies are edible and they're delicious just straight off the plant. I love them. They have a lot of great benefits too. And I did a video on that as well as a video on calendula and a video on nasturtium. And so I'll link to all three of those videos in the description box down below. Don't forget to click on either more or show more, whichever one shows up for you, somewhere right down here below the video screen to open the description box. So I'm not actually making the kimchi today, but I did take a lot of images of what I was doing. I realized for a lot of you, your gardens are probably going to be done. All these kind of flowers are going to be done, but at least it'll give you some ideas to consider for next year, as well as helping you to be more creative when it comes to putting up ferments. Your traditional kimchi is made using a salt brine, just like you do with sauerkraut. So the main difference between the two is partly the way it's cut. Kimchi is usually cut more in chunks, where sauerkraut is shredded. So that, and then the spices are used. So the common spices used in kimchi are going to be onion, garlic, ginger, and some kind of hot pepper. A lot of times cayenne pepper is used, which I would commonly use for making the traditional kimchi that I did for years. It's probably been at least 25 years ago that I started making the kimchi the traditional way. So that's using the salt brine and you let it sit overnight and so on and so forth. But in the case of a floral kimchi like this, and also in your cucumber kimchi, I don't recommend using a salt brine method. I recommend using my favorite method now for making any kind of kimchi, no matter what it is, and that is using the fermentation starter. And I always have at least 2 different fermentation starters ready at a time because it just depends. If I'm doing a lot of different types of ferment, I always like to have at least 2. And what I have right now is a dandelion ginger and raisin, and these get changed up. This actually started as just a dandelion fermentation starter that I started last year, I think it was, and then this year I added some I took out the old dandelion, added fresh dandelion, and then threw in some ginger as well. So ginger bug is what's commonly is the one that people are most familiar with, without realizing that you can make your starter out of anything. It doesn't matter if it's an herb, a fruit, a vegetable, anything. It can be in anything as fresh or dried. I only do not recommend frozen. It may work, but then again, it may not. Frozen is a little more iffy when it comes to trying to get a starter going. So I'm not going to go in all the details on how to make this, but it's super easy. All you need is whatever you picked out of your garden or have in your refrigerator, something fresh or dried, water, and sugar. That's all you need to get the starter, and then just a few days time to let it get good and bubbly. So you want your starter in an active phase, not one that's already turned to wine or vinegar, and you want to keep it active. So I'm going to link to that video I did, the full-length video, where I go over all those details on how to make it, how to refresh it, how to keep it alive, and how to use it, and all the many things you can use it in. So yes, in this case, I do highly recommend having a starter ready. So get this ready first, because you're going to need at least 3 days until it's ready to use. When I made kimchi the traditional way, because I used the brine, I would do it in a big glass bowl, mix it up, and then add all my stuff in there after I strained out the brine and rinsed it. And then I'd add in my carrots and garlic and onions and more. But now what I do, especially since I'm using the starter and I don't have to use the brine, I always do it right in the jar, no matter what kind of kimchi I'm making. And so in that case, what I like to do is layer it. So for the sake of not only making it look pretty, but making sure everything's well mixed up, when you go to serve yourself out of that jar, it's good to make sure all this stuff's mixed up. And it's also good to make sure, especially as you're adding your garlic and your ginger and your onions, that those are, and your pepper too, that those are in there mixing all through the liquid to really flavor that kimchi. I layer the flowers, the onions, the garlic, the ginger that in this case I do peel. It depends on how I'm using the ginger. If I'm cooking with it, I may just leave the peels on, especially if I'm cutting it small. But for the kimchi, I find I prefer to have it peeled. So I did peel the ginger, and fresh is best if you have it. And then again, layering it, adding it in little bits at a time. And especially with the flowers, pack it in tight. You're going to want it packed in tight, because as noted, it's going to make a lot of liquid, and the less water you can add to it, the better. And then with the peppers, what I do is I add them in 2 sections. So I like to use, now that I started drying up my Chinese 5-color peppers, that's why the color looks like this, because it's all 5 of the colors mixed together, or cayenne pepper. And that's going to be to taste. However much you want to add is going to be up to you. So about at the halfway point, I'll add about a teaspoon of salt. That's just for flavor. And then I don't measure it. I just do what sounds good to me. This pepper's pretty hot, so it depends on how spicy you want it. But I'll put in a little bit, I'll sprinkle in a little bit of the ground pepper. And then I also will sprinkle in a little bit of red pepper flakes. And the main purpose of this is I love the color they add. And then I'll layer again the different flowers, the ginger, the onions, the chopped garlic. I think I forgot to say that, but chopped garlic, I put that in there. You can also use granulated garlic. That works fine too. I've done that when I didn't have fresh or fermented garlic on hand. And in this case, it was actually fermented garlic that I keep in the fridge. And then when I get to the top, I go ahead and add more pepper. And so it's at least at the halfway point and at the top. At that point, I'm going to add my fermentation starter. Now, the amount you add of your fermentation starter, it's just going to be the liquid that you strain off. It's going to depend on the size jar. So this is a quart size jar. So for every quart, you need a 1/4 cup of your fermentation starter. So if you're doing a 1/2 gallon, then you need a 1/2 cup. If you're doing a whole gallon, a whole cup. That's how it's easy to remember. 1/4 cup per quart is what you need. And then I'll pour that over the top. You want to make sure you do that before you add any more liquid. And then if you can press everything down even more, do it. I did top off with filtered rainwater. I always have several jugs of filtered rainwater we collect ourselves, because it's important that your water does not have chlorine in it. I'm not saying it won't work at all, but it will certainly slow things down and may prevent fermentation at all. So if you're relying on city tap water, that's fine, but you're going to want to dechlorinate your water first. So what I used to do is, before we got our rainwater collection system set up, I would use the same glass jugs. I'd fill them up with tap water. I would set them out and just cover with a cloth and a rubber band, so that the cloth would prevent lint, dust, and whatever else from getting in there. And then I would give it 3 days to at least to dechlorinate. And the reason so long for that, typically if it's in a nice open container, within a day the chlorine should be gone, but I want to make sure it's gone, but also because the opening of the jug was so small, I would give it at least 3 days to make sure. And that was what I would use to ferment with. So if you don't have a rainwater collection or a well, that's fine. Even well water can be tricky though, because sometimes it can be high mineral, so you may still need to filter a lot of those minerals out, because too many minerals can prevent a good ferment as well. I just put a regular cap on like this, and I put it on snug, not super tight, and let it sit on my counter. I always keep one of my handmade coasters underneath it, which by the way, if you crochet, this is my own pattern, and I have a video out there on this pattern. So if you want to learn how to make these, I have them in all different colors. But anyway, and then I set that under there. That way, if it does leak a little bit, there's something catching it. You can also set it on top of a towel. I just like using the coasters because it looks a little prettier. Make sure that, by the way, that you do this. Kind of shake it back and forth to make sure everything's mixing in well. And I recommend doing that once a day for the 3 days. And if it's not bubbly by day 3, just give it time. And oh, by the way, after you shake it, you're going to want to burp it to help release the gases. Now, some people use the pickling tops. I have no interest in them. I know some people love them, especially like Doug and Stacy, because they have a lot of things fermenting. I totally get that. That way you don't have to worry about burping it every day. As the gases build up in there, it's going to cause pressure, and it can then start leaking out or even blow the top off of your jar. That's why it's a good idea to burp it. You can use a regular canning top. You don't have to use a top like this. I tend to like to look for something that matches the ingredients and looks nice. If it's not ready by day 3, it could just be because wherever you're fermenting it is in a colder area. Things can ferment, and kimchi typically was fermented in cold storage, whether it be buried in the ground or in the refrigerator. That's where I used to always ferment my kimchi when I did it the traditional way. It would take 2 weeks to do it that way though. So the colder it is, the longer it's going to take. The warmer it is, the quicker. Usually 3 days is pretty standard, especially when you're using the starter. But 4 or 5 days is fine. And I've just actually been leaving this on the counter. I don't always refrigerate my kimchi. Sometimes leaving it out reminds me it's there and it doesn't get buried to the back of the refrigerator. The onions that I used in this particular blend here were the green onions from my garden. Now, adding green onions is fine. In the case of a floral kimchi like this, if you like having some crunch, I recommend adding your standard white or yellow or even red onions, something that's going to still have a crunch to it, because your flowers are not going to stay crunchy. They just won't. And I like to have a little bit of crunch in my kimchi. Another option, or to go with that, is I tend to add carrots to my kimchi a lot, especially raw carrots, so that I can have that nice crunch in there as well as the color. And I did not do that with this because I was just trying to focus on the flowers plus the onions and garlic and ginger for the flavor. Next time I do a floral type kimchi like this, I'm also going to consider adding a little bit of horseradish leaf to that. I do this with my cucumber kimchi, and it keeps the cucumbers nice and crisp. And I'm talking not even using pickling cucumbers. I'm talking about straight 8 cucumbers, and adding the horseradish leaf made a difference in keeping them crunchy for months. I recommend just a piece about this big if you're doing a quart jar at the bottom and at the top of your ingredients, and that will help keep things a little crunchier, especially if it's something you're going to let sit for a long time. And especially with the floral kimchi, plus the reason I like using the horseradish leaves instead of grape leaves, because that's a good option too, is because of the flavor. It adds just a hint of the horseradish flavor. So yeah, 3 to 4 days, it should be ready, and then just enjoy. As you do that, you'll learn, okay, well, what else would I like to try? Kale is a good one. Collards are good. You know, anything in the brassica family is great. Radishes are really good. But anyway, just experiment. You can do even smaller jars, like pint jars. And in that case, you'd only use an 1/8 cup of fermentation starter if you're wanting to have a bunch of different jars going, so you can experiment with the different greens coming from your garden or flowers or whatever it is that you're growing. And what I'm going to do, besides linking to the fermentation starter video itself, I'll link to my full fermentation playlist that I've had going since 2016, so you can scroll through there and see all the many different things. So anyway, just some more ideas for your fermentation fun. Just start thinking outside the box and be creative with what you got. All right, well, thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.